What if the scariest horror of the 1970s was not in cinemas, but inside the family television set? Britain became a battleground where bold writers, anxious parents, and moral campaigners clashed over violence, blasphemy, sex, witchcraft, and nightmares before bedtime. Some shows were banned outright. Some were cut. Others aired once and haunted viewers for decades. Tonight, these are the 15 banned, censored, and protested TV horrors that turned ordinary living rooms into national arguments across Britain's uneasy homes. 15. A Photograph, 1977. Some horrors do not scream at you. They sit quietly in the corner and let paranoia do the damage. A Photograph, broadcast as part of Play for Today, was not a monster story in the traditional sense, but it belonged to that unsettling 70s tradition where a simple domestic mystery could slowly become something colder, stranger, and more threatening. The story begins with an image, a clue, a fragment of reality that refuses to explain itself. From there, the tension grows through suspicion, conspiracy, and the terrible feeling that ordinary people have stumbled into something much larger than themselves. This is exactly why 70s television became so dangerous to moral guardians. It did not need blood every 5 minutes. It could disturb viewers with mood, implication, and psychological pressure. A Photograph was not banned in the same way as Scum or Brimstone and Treacle, but it belongs on this list because it reflects the atmosphere that made the era so controversial. Television drama had stopped comforting the public. Instead, it was asking viewers to question reality, authority, and even their own safety. For a Britain already anxious about crime, politics, and social collapse, that was its own kind of horror. 14. Shadows, 1975. Before children had streaming warnings, parental controls, or algorithm-friendly labels, they had shows like Shadows quietly slipping unease into their after-school viewing. This anthology series was made for younger audiences, but it often carried the emotional temperature of adult horror. Ghostly presences, strange time slips, haunted objects, and stories where children faced mysteries no adult could easily explain. That was the genius and the danger. It did not talk down to young viewers. It treated their fears as serious. For moral campaigners, this was precisely the problem. A children's program did not need explicit violence to be accused of going too far. If it left children frightened, sleepless, or asking strange questions at the dinner table, then it could become part of the wider panic over what television was doing to young minds. Shadows aired, but it now feels like part of a lost era when children's TV was allowed to be genuinely eerie. Today, viewers remember it not because it was polished or expensive, but because it carried that unmistakable 70s chill, quiet, gray, intelligent, and far more disturbing than anyone expected from a children's slot. 13. Supernatural, 1977. The title did not whisper. It announced exactly what it was offering: Supernatural. This BBC anthology wrapped itself in old Gothic tradition, with the fictional Club of the Damned as its framing device, where stories of curses, vampires, spirits, and doomed aristocrats unfolded like forbidden tales told after midnight. It was not the loud, bloody horror of later decades. It was candlelit, theatrical, and heavy with dread. Every episode seemed to suggest that evil was not just possible, but civilized, elegant, and waiting behind a polished door. That kind of horror was deeply uncomfortable for the moral atmosphere of the time. The 1970s were already full of anxiety about permissiveness, occult fascination, and television pushing too far into adult territory. A series like Supernatural did not need to be banned to feel dangerous. Its very premise made it seem like the BBC was inviting the occult into respectable homes. For horror fans, it was Gothic pleasure. For campaigners who feared television was normalizing darkness, it was another warning sign. The show now feels like a relic from a time when British TV horror did not chase jump scares. It invited viewers into a room, locked the door, and let the shadows do the talking. 12. Beasts. During Barty's Party, 1976. No demons. No graveyards. No masked killer. Just a married couple, a radio broadcast, and the sound of rats getting closer. During Barty's Party, one of the most terrifying episodes of Nigel Kneale's Beasts turned the ordinary British home into a trap. That was what made it so nasty. The episode does not give viewers the comfort of seeing everything clearly. Much of the horror comes through sound, suggestion, and the slow collapse of control. The unseen rats become more frightening than any creature's suit could have been. In a decade when campaigners were already accusing television of traumatizing viewers, this was nightmare engineering. The terror was domestic, claustrophobic, and horribly believable. It suggested that safety was an illusion, that the walls of the home could fail, and that nature itself could rise up against modern life. During Barty's Party was not officially banned, but it became one of those broadcasts people remembered with a shiver. It represents the kind of 70s horror that moral critics could not easily categorize. There was no cheap gore to attack, no simple obscenity to condemn. Instead, it did something worse. It made ordinary viewers feel trapped in their own living rooms. 11. Beasts. Baby, 1976. There is something uniquely disturbing about horror that begins with renovation. A couple moves into a new home, tears into the walls, and finds something that should have stayed hidden. In Baby, Nigel Neal created one of the most unsettling pieces of folk horror ever made for television. The story mixes pregnancy anxiety, rural superstition, domestic unease, and the horrifying discovery of a strange preserved creature inside the house. It feels like the past has not died. It has simply been sealed behind plaster, waiting. For 1970s audiences, this hit a raw nerve. Britain was changing fast, but shows like Baby suggested that old beliefs, old rituals, and old fears were still alive beneath modern surfaces. That was exactly the kind of idea that frightened moral conservatives. It was not just horror, it was a challenge to the clean, rational image of modern family life. The episode aired, but its afterlife is pure controversy fuel. It is the kind of TV horror that feels whispered about, rather than promoted. No wonder it became a cult nightmare. Baby did not simply ask what was inside the wall, it asked what was buried inside the culture itself. 10. The Stone Tape, 1972. Christmas night should have been safe. Instead, BBC Two gave viewers The Stone Tape, Nigel Neal's terrifying fusion of science fiction and ghost story. A research team moves into an old building and discovers that the haunting may not be a ghost in the traditional sense, but a recording of trauma embedded in the stone itself. That idea became so influential that the phrase stone tape theory entered paranormal culture. BFI's own material describes the story around scientists in an abandoned mansion discovering that a supposedly haunted room may hold a recorded trace of the past. What made it so disturbing was its cold logic. The stone tape did not comfort viewers with religion, folklore, or a simple afterlife. It suggested that horror could be mechanical, environmental, and endlessly replayed. For a moral panic era, that was chilling in a different way. This was not a devil you could banish. It was suffering turned into signal. The program was not banned, but it proved that television horror had become intellectually dangerous. It could enter the home on Christmas, dress itself as serious drama, and leave viewers with a concept they could never fully shake. 9. Robin Redbreast, 1970. Before The Wicker Man made folk horror iconic, Robin Redbreast brought rural menace into British living rooms. The setup sounds deceptively simple. A woman leaves the city, moves into the countryside, and slowly realizes the village around her may not be quaint at all. It may be organized around something older, colder, and far more controlling. There are no easy monsters here. The horror comes from smiles, customs, glances, and the creeping feeling that the community has already decided your fate. This was exactly the kind of television that unsettled the 70s moral imagination. Robin Redbreast dealt with sexuality, pregnancy, isolation, and pagan suggestion at a time when Britain was already arguing about permissiveness and the decline of traditional values. It aired, but it did not feel harmless. It felt like the BBC had smuggled a ritual nightmare into serious drama clothing. Modern folk horror fans now see it as a key early example of the form, but for viewers at the time, it must have felt almost indecently intimate. The terror was not out in the woods. It was in the neighbors' polite conversation, in the village routine, and in the awful suspicion that everyone knew the ending except you. 8. Penda's Fen, 1974. Penda's Fen is the kind of television play that sounds impossible until you realize the 1970s actually allowed this kind of madness on screen. It follows a vicar's son wrestling with religion, sexuality, English identity, politics, music, angels, demons, and visions of King Penda. This was not ordinary horror. It was spiritual, symbolic, and deeply strange. Real Streets summarizes it as a story where conflicting forces within England collide through the growing pains of an adolescent vicar's son who encounters angels, Edward Elgar, and King Penda himself. That mixture made it powerful, but also dangerous. Penda's fen touched subjects that moral campaigners were extremely sensitive about: faith, the body, national identity, and forbidden desire. It was not banned, but it absolutely belongs in this moral panic landscape because it represented the kind of television that refused to stay in safe categories. Was it horror? Was it religious drama? Was it political allegory? Was it a coming-of-age nightmare? The answer was yes to all of them, and that was the problem. Penda's fen did not simply frighten viewers. It disturbed the foundations they used to understand themselves. 7. Children of the Stones, 1977. For a generation of British children, the phrase "happy day" was never innocent again. Children of the Stones aired as a children's serial, but it carried the mood of a full adult folk horror nightmare. Set around a village trapped by standing stones, psychic forces, and smiling conformity, the show took ancient landscape horror and placed it directly into children's television. BFI describes it as one of the most prominent folk horror series of the 70s and calls it perhaps one of the scariest children's programs ever made. That is why it fits this list so well. It was not banned, but it became legendary because it felt too intense for its slot. Children were not being given simple monsters to defeat. They were being shown social control, pagan power, and a village where happiness itself felt brainwashed. In the climate of Mary Whitehouse-style concern over what children were watching, Children of the Stones felt like proof that television had crossed into dangerous territory. It is now loved precisely because it trusted young viewers with fear. But at the time, that trust could easily look like recklessness. 6. The Exorcism, 1972. Some television horrors creep in through graveyards. The Exorcism walks straight into the middle-class dining room and poisoned the entire evening. Broadcast as part of the BBC anthology Dead of Night, this disturbing drama begins with a group of comfortable friends gathering in a country cottage for what should be a civilized night of food, wine, and conversation. But slowly, the house begins to turn against them. The lights fail, the atmosphere thickens, the meal becomes impossible to enjoy. Something old, hungry, and furious seems to be inside the walls, punishing the guests for a crime they did not personally commit, but may still benefit from. That is what makes The Exorcism so powerful. It is not just a ghost story. It is class guilt turned into supernatural horror. The terror comes from the idea that the past is not dead, especially when the comfortable present has been built over someone else's suffering. In the uneasy Britain of the 1970s, that kind of story had a sharp edge. It attacked wealth, privilege, and social hypocrisy while dressing itself as a haunted house nightmare. This was not an official banned program, but it absolutely belongs in this moral panic world, because it showed how far television horror was willing to go. It did not offer safe scares. It made viewers feel trapped at the table with people who were slowly discovering that their comfort had a cost. By the end, the cottage no longer feels cozy or respectable. It feels like a courtroom, a tomb, and a curse all at once. 5. Lost Hearts, 1973. A child alone in a strange old house is already unsettling, but Lost Hearts made that simple idea feel almost wicked. Adapted from the ghost story by M.R. James, this chilling drama follows a young orphan sent to live with an elderly relative in a remote country mansion. At first, the house seems grand, quiet, and almost protective. But soon, the boy begins to see ghostly children, hear strange music, and sense that the old man caring for him may not be the kindly guardian he appears to be. The horror of Lost Hearts comes from betrayal. It takes the familiar Victorian image of the respectable old scholar and turns him into something deeply sinister. The story suggests ritual, obsession, and the exploitation of children by an adult who hides evil behind education, manners, and age. That is exactly why it feels so uncomfortable in a list about moral fear. This was television horror entering family spaces with a story about vulnerable children, secret violence, and the terrifying possibility that adults could be the real monsters. It was not banned, but it became one of those 70s broadcasts that stayed in people's heads because it felt too cold, too cruel, and too eerie for ordinary seasonal television. The ghost children are not just frightening images, they are warnings. They show what happens when innocence is treated as something to be used. In a decade when campaigners were already worried about what horror might do to young viewers, Lost Hearts offered a nightmare about young viewers' deepest fear: being alone, powerless, and watched by someone who should have protected you. 4. The Signalman, 1976. Few television horrors feel as lonely as The Signalman. Adapted from Charles Dickens, it takes place around a railway cutting, a tunnel, and a man whose job is to watch for danger before it arrives. But the signalman is haunted by a figure near the tunnel mouth, a ghostly warning that seems connected to disaster, death, and events he cannot prevent. There are no cheap shocks here. The terror is slow, foggy, and fatalistic. Every bell, every light, every passing train seems to carry the weight of doom. What makes the signalman so effective is its atmosphere of helplessness. The main character is not reckless or foolish. He is careful, responsible, and painfully aware that something is wrong. Yet he cannot stop the pattern from repeating. That gives the story a deeper emotional horror. It is not just about seeing a ghost. It is about knowing that disaster is coming and being unable to change it. For 1970s audiences, this kind of drama showed why television horror could be so unsettling without being graphic. It used silence, landscape, and dread instead of blood. It turned industrial Britain into a haunted place, where modern technology did not defeat superstition but seemed to amplify it. The Signalman was not officially banned, but it fits perfectly in this controversial era because it represents the kind of serious, intelligent horror that made family viewing feel unsafe in a different way. It did not shock through violence. It frightened through inevitability. By the end, the tunnel feels like more than a railway passage. It feels like the mouth of fate itself. 3. Doctor Who, The Deadly Assassin, 1976. This was not just another scary Doctor Who serial. This was the moment a family adventure show became a national argument. In The Deadly Assassin, the Doctor is thrown into one of the strangest and most violent nightmares the program had ever attempted. Inside the Matrix, he is hunted through a surreal landscape of assassination, paranoia, combat, and psychological terror. It felt less like ordinary Saturday evening science fiction and more like a fever dream smuggled into tea-time television. But the real explosion came at the end of Part 3, when the Doctor's head was forced underwater in a shocking drowning cliffhanger. Viewers were left for a full week with the image of a beloved children's hero apparently being killed on screen. For moral campaigner Mary Whitehouse, that was the breaking point. She condemned the scene, arguing that children would carry that image in their minds long after the episode ended. The BBC apologized, and the sequence was later edited so the original drowning cliffhanger would not appear in the same way during repeat broadcasts. That is why The Deadly Assassin belongs so high on this list. It was not only protested, it was actually altered because of the backlash. For horror fans, the serial proved how bold and cinematic Doctor Who could become when it embraced danger. But for campaigners, it crossed a dangerous line because the violence felt intense, prolonged, and attached to a hero children deeply trusted. The controversy helped push the show away from the darker Gothic style of the mid-70s and toward a lighter tone. In the end, one drowning cliffhanger did more than scare viewers. It helped reshape the future of British family television. 2. Brimstone and Treacle, 1976. Some television dramas are controversial because people see them. Brimstone and Treacle became notorious because people were told they were not allowed to. Written by Dennis Potter for Play for Today, this disturbing BBC drama centered on a mysterious young man who enters the home of a middle-class couple caring for their severely disabled daughter. From the start, the atmosphere is wrong. The visitor seems charming, helpful, even angelic on the surface, but something darker hangs around him. The story mixes religion, evil, disability, sexual violence, family resentment, and a possible demonic presence in a way that made the BBC deeply uneasy. The play was withdrawn before transmission and effectively banned, finally reaching British television years later. That delay only made its reputation darker. Once audiences hear that something has been locked away, imagination begins doing the work. People start asking what could be so dangerous, so offensive, or so disturbing that even a broadcaster famous for serious drama refused to show it. Brimstone and Treacle became the perfect moral panic object, religiously provocative, sexually troubling, politically ugly, and emotionally difficult to describe without sounding shocking. What makes it so powerful is that it is not a ghost story in the simple sense. Its horror is spiritual, domestic, and psychological. Evil does not arrive with thunder, fangs, or a haunted castle. It enters an ordinary home smiling politely, speaking softly, and slowly poisoning the air. That is why the ban became part of its legend. For a Britain already fighting over decency, censorship, and what television should be allowed to show, brimstone and treacle felt like forbidden evidence from the darkest corner of the national living room. 1. Scum, 1977. At number 1 is the television horror that had no ghosts, no witches, no demons, and no supernatural curse. And that is exactly why it was so terrifying. Scum, directed by Alan Clark and written by Roy Minton, exposed the brutal world of a British borstal, where young offenders were supposed to be disciplined, reformed, and prepared for life outside. Instead, the drama showed a system built on fear, humiliation, violence, bullying, and institutional cruelty. The horror did not come from fantasy. It came from locked doors, official silence, and the terrifying idea that the people in charge were part of the nightmare. The BBC refused to transmit the original television version because of its violent and disturbing content. That decision instantly turned Scum into one of the most notorious banned dramas of the decade. Later, Clark remade it as a cinema film, but the original television version remained legendary because it represented something television executives feared deeply: realism so harsh it could not be comfortably explained away. What makes Scum so powerful is that it destroys the safe distance viewers usually get from horror. A vampire can be dismissed as fiction. A haunted house can be escaped when the credits roll. But Scum forced audiences to confront a brutal system that claimed to protect society while crushing the young people inside it. Its violence was not decorative. It was political. It asked whether the real scandal was the material on screen or the reality being hidden off-screen. That is why Scum earns the top spot. It was not just banned because it was disturbing. It was disturbing because it felt painfully, angrily real. So the real question is not which of these shows was the scariest. The real question is why a single television broadcast could frighten an entire country into arguing about morality, childhood, religion, violence, and control. Some were banned, some were cut. Some simply refused to leave people's memories. And that is the strange power of 1970s TV horror. It did not just haunt the screen, it haunted the nation.